Hi everyone, we're quite a small number, so we were discussing that if you have something you really want to mention at a certain point, imagine you're in a Zoom meeting and you press the raise your hand button, except you actually physically have to raise your own hand because we're in person, not online. So please do that if you fancy at any point. But we're here with Mark Bowles, and I'm going to read out a brief introduction. Mark Bowles grew up between Bradford and Leeds and went on to study English at Liverpool and Oxford universities. All My Precious Madness is his first novel, so exciting to be here today to celebrate the release. It's only been out for 2 days, and so far I've read a rave review in every single newspaper I've opened, which is quite an impressive feat. I read it last week, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about its mysteries, its extreme anger, the wordplay, the momentum, and the violence at the end. To give those of you who haven't read it yet a sense of what I'm talking about, we thought we'd open with a reading from the start of the book, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. So I'm just going to read from the very opening of the book. All of the book is written from the point of view of Henry Nash. He's the narrator. So it's, in a way, an extended monologue. So it starts like this. One night I had lain down in bed, ready to go to sleep. I had put on the music, as I always did, but as I lay there in the darkness, it struck me that the lights were still on in the bookshop. I had not switched them off. It was midnight. I wanted to check the lights. I didn't want him, the owner, the corduroy waistcoat, the fuckweasel, to come in the morning with the lights still on. Only the week before there had been a note on the desk saying I had left the place in a mess, a charge that was quite unjust, if not an outright lie. But I'd been upset by this note. It had taken the wind out of my sails. So I put on my slippers and went out into that cool September night. I remembered that it was in fact unusually cool for September. For some reason I wore my slippers to go out. I'm not sure why I wore my slippers rather than my shoes, but I did. As if Oxford were only a series of rooms. As if Oxford wasn't quite a real city, but only a grand house through which one could walk at leisure beneath a remote and sparkling ceiling. And I walked out in my slippers to the bookshop to check the lights. In fact, they were off. I hadn't left them on at all. I'd misremembered or imagined leaving them on, as I lay in bed, in the dark, on the border of sleep, with the soft notes falling and rising. And now, only half an hour later, I was stood outside the shop in the cool air, wearing my slippers, looking in through the window. I decided to enter. It was a simple mortise lock, and there was no alarm. Imagine. You find it improbable, but it's true anyhow. I went inside and turned on the lights, and I sat at the desk by the window. I took down a number of first editions from the foreign literature section, including the tragic Schultz, whose drawings are dug from the corners of our dreams, and also a 1972 translation of Paul Celan, Inside the House, the Drifting Snow of What Was Left Unspoken. Yes, Inside the House, exactly. I had never read this book before, but each word glowed with meaning as it never would again. In fact, I have never since been able to fully access these poems, as if a gate had been placed in front of them. But that night the gate was open, and I simply received them like a gift, a libation that irrigated my body and mind. Only later did I discover that Celan killed himself by jumping from the Pont Mirabeau into the Seine, but this is of no importance. I sat there reading the book at what was well after midnight. Occasionally some drunk students would walk past and point or call out, but I did not listen. I sat there illuminated by the book. I sat there for 3 hours at the desk in the bookshop. They were hours stolen from sleep and as luminous and vivid as a dream. It was not that 3 hours passed quickly, but that no hours passed. Time was excluded. It had to wait in the alleyway across the street like a beggar for me to come out of the shop. I can honestly say that this moment, or rather this whole divagation, from leaving the house in my slippers, to sitting in the bookshop reading, to returning to the house, this was one of the most enigmatic and mysterious experiences I have ever enjoyed, as if directed by an occult hand, as if interpolated from another life. An experience like this, that burns only once, unexpectedly, therefore burns forever. The light in the window, still there, and me at the table, even now, exempt from time and harm.
Thank you so much for reading that. I think you could give the audiobook a run for its money with the sense of being in a monologue, but of course not. The audiobook is read so wonderfully. So that passage immediately locates us as readers and as listeners in Henry's world.
Yes.
a world of bookshops and slippers
Yes.
and French poets.
Yes.
But it takes us a little longer to understand where this is all being written and narrated from.
Yes.
Henry is sitting in an Italian cafe in Soho
Yes.
and spinning a world of digressions and memory around him, from Oxford to the years he spent as a salesperson. It's one unbroken set of reminiscences, really, and it works wonderfully well when it's in the audiobook. But could you tell us a bit about how you came to find this voice? We were talking about how Paul Hilton, who, when he read the audiobook, kind of inhabited it as if it were a character on stage. Did you have to do a similar process for writing it?
Yes, I think I did inhabit it very much, the voice. I think it started as a voice, so I didn't have a fully conceived plot. I didn't sit down with a plot and a plan. I rarely do. So I started writing various fragments. Many of them were autobiographical, and they were reminiscences about my time in Oxford or the telesales office, various other things. And it was apparent to me that I was writing with the same voice, and that it was a character. And it was, I think, an exaggerated or magnified version of my own voice in some ways, yeah? So the magnification of the rage, the magnification of the lyricism. So it was an exaggerated or magnified version of my own voice. But I found it very easy to slip into that voice. I found it very easy to inhabit that voice, and I felt that it was like there was something to I don't know, like a cathartic process, that until I'd written the novel, this voice would be in my head. So, I mean, that makes it sound like it's some sort of catharsis or therapeutic process. So maybe it was, you know, but the story came after the voice. So the story was like determined by what story will best allow this voice to flourish and to continue. And I think we absolutely found the right reader for this with Paul, because Paul similarly just immersed himself in the character and inhabited the character and just treated it like a monologue, which, I mean, it is a monologue, and went through that same digressive trajectory that the narrator goes through, because his mind, his way of being, is an incredible. Yeah, it operates through a series of detours and digressions, but as he puts it, in a way they're not digressions. They're little pockets where the truth can breathe. Right? You don't approach something directly. Like, the best way to approach it is indirectly and through digression, and you kind of come at something left-handed, and it illuminates a certain angle of it, and then you approach it a different way, and it illuminates a different angle of it. So there's no like linear path. Until arguably, like, the final incident of the novel, or the penultimate incident, and somehow is after that his voice is, I think, slightly different. But yeah, there's a lot of rage in the voice.
So there's a lot of rage in you as well.
I think there was. I think there's less now. I think there's less, maybe partly as a result of writing the book. But yeah, I think, I mean, you know, I do get irritated by people who order their latte in a takeaway cup and then sit in the cafe.
That was one of the
takeaway
messages
cup.
I wanted to ask you about. It's so wonderful.
Like, it really irritates me that they do that. I mean, so most of the irritations are my irritations.
You call them sloppy lattes.
Sloppy lattes. It's like, you know, they order these massive lattes. It's mostly milk, and there's just like a double shot of coffee, but it's mostly milk, and they probably can't even taste the coffee.
Yeah.
It's irritating. But all of the irritations are my irritations. I think probably there's a few exceptions, you know, but they're just magnified, and the process of writing the book just allows me to kind of exorcise them, as it were.
There are so many things in that I think we should touch on, and so I hope we have time to get onto them all. But I wanted to begin really by asking kind of about Henry's life, and one thing which really came to me through reading the book and listening to it as well was a kind of anger about class and class differences and the ways in which his life kind of charts what might be called like the Saltburn trajectory of going to Oxford and discovering new things, but he kind of rails against it as well. And I wanted to ask you a bit about that, and just if you could speak a bit more about writing that and everything. Yeah,
sure. I think, he's very much aware of coming from a fairly working class background, and then when he goes to Oxford, on the one hand, I mean, he idealises Oxford. It's a place where intellectuals and disaffected geniuses have come and converged. Of course, Oxford isn't like that in reality, but I mean, he kind of holds on to that illusion that it is, and he manages to find people who help to consolidate that illusion. So the people that he finds, who are mostly graduate students, not even undergraduates, help him to maintain that image of Oxford that he has, but he also encounters people who have got there through privilege, who expected to be there, who are not surprised at being there, who just kind of almost inherited their place in Oxford in a sense, who have just, I think he puts it, that they've kind of just walked through their own garden somehow into the quad and then started discussing their mutual acquaintances. He's very much aware that Oxford is founded on privilege and exclusion, and that the taken for grantedness that the people that he meets there have, and he kind of resents the fact that he's had to kind of really work through this kind of autodidactic labour, this massive autodidactic labour, what other people somehow can just presuppose and take for granted. So there's that resentment there. And I think he also is mindful of like historical class injustice. So there's this passage, which, I mean, I don't think we'll probably have time to read it out, where he talks about how Wittgenstein is celebrated for building a house for his sister. And but he's like, but, you know, on the one hand, Wittgenstein was of impossibly rich parentage and trained as, you know, and had the educational benefits. It really wasn't that much of a thing for him to build this house for his sister, because he was born and raised near the summit of privilege. And then he contrasts this with his grandfather, who was like a welder who fought as a private in the Second World War, who built his own bungalow. And he said the grandfather had to, first of all, before he could do anything, have to, you know, get books out of the local library about how to build a house and lay the foundations and do all this. So just to get to the point that from which Wittgenstein started, the grandfather had to do this incredible labour. And in a way, the grandfather's house is a bigger and more admirable achievement than Wittgenstein's sister's, the house that Wittgenstein built for his sister, because he had to go a greater distance. And he says loads of people are just parachuted on the hill of privilege, really near the top, and then they get to the top and look at me, look at the heights that I've reached. Whereas these poor working class people are starting off right at the bottom of the hill, and then they've had to make their own hiking boots and everything else in order to get to the top of the hill. And so he's aware, from his point of view, of these incredible disparities, the social injustice, and the way in which people like him have had to, have had to labour at the table of learning. And you know, he didn't, like, he says that when he went to Oxford, it's not just about his knowledge of literature and culture, it's like just things like he didn't even know what an avocado was till he went to Oxford and things like that. Like he'd never seen one, or he'd only had instant coffee, and all these people just take these things for granted, and he has to like learn about them and so on and so forth. So yeah, he's very much aware of his class background. Even he's paradoxical, isn't he? Because he kind of he spurns in a way his origins, but in a way the destination is something that he also then recoils from because of its privilege.
One of the things I really love is he absolutely disdains, I say really love as if he's being very problematic and difficult at the time, but I think it's a wonderful vignette of how much he hates his boss, who spends a lot of money on first editions, because he thinks, why would you get to own them if you don't appreciate them at all? It's kind of wonderful.
Oh yeah. His boss just buys them as an investment, buys these first editions of Beckett. And obviously Henry is a big fan of Beckett. And he says that it will be an ethical act of the highest order to steal them from his boss because he doesn't deserve them, he has no real love of them.
It's one of his great flights of your project.
And he's just buying them as an investment because his boss is someone who just sees everything in terms of money. And so he doesn't deserve to have these first editions. And then his boss is always pestering him to go to the theatre because he thinks it's like that's what you do if you're cultured and middle class. And so Henry says that he inflicts Endgame on him. He takes him to see Endgame by Samuel Beckett. And at the end of the play, the audience has just been completely silenced. So this boss, this middle-class culture boss, doesn't really know what to say. Apart from, he starts saying he doesn't like Beckett's view of the world. He's like, the play's not there to communicate Beckett's view of the world. But anyway, sorry.
No, I love that. Brilliant digression, very much in the style of the book.
Yes.
One of the things I think you do very well, and I think it's a really hard thing for novelists to do well, is to write about childhood and depict it in a kind of accurate, or if it can't be accurate, in a feeling way that doesn't automatically talk down to it or something. And your passages set in the school about the indignities of lunchboxes and bullying, and just wonderful vignettes about how people might feel humiliated by wearing too short trousers or having cheese sandwiches are so wonderfully done.
Thank you.
And I just thought they were absolutely wonderful. And I wonder if you would read a passage about Henry's father to try and situate us more in that world.
Yeah, I could read a passage about Henry's father. The passage that I had in mind doesn't relate to the schools as such.
Yeah.
Just to say, this passage, the whole book is kind of haunted by the memory of his father, who's died, and the end of the book is really a monograph about his father. But I thought I'd read this passage because it connects with the earlier passage where he's in the bookshop that he's gained entry to with his set of keys. But he keeps returning to his father. Just before he died, my father stopped having Weetabix for breakfast and developed a taste for grapefruit. There was a funny taste in his Weetabix, he said. At first he tried a different packet, but it was still there. It had been infected with a new taste he found disgusting. It made him switch to grapefruit, which he'd never eaten before or liked. Suddenly he liked grapefruit after 50 years of Weetabix. This is how death announces itself. Tiny changes, little pin-sized holes in the ordinary fabric, until suddenly one day the whole thing disintegrates. The last time I saw my father alive, I addressed him as mate. We were at the train station in Bradford. We'd arrived with moments to spare. There was no time to say goodbye on the platform. We had to say goodbye in the car, before I made a dash for it. And for some reason, when my father said goodbye, son, I replied with, goodbye, mate. For a long time it irked me that I said this, for no reason, having never called him mate, and that this inexplicable farewell was the last memory of interacting with my father. But it strikes me now that this was perhaps one of those anomalies, those glitches, like the funny taste in his Weetabix. In any case, back then I worked at the shithouse sales office, Belsham, and ached with regret at having left Oxford, and longed even for the days of my illness when I worked at that antique and rare bookshop on the High Street next to Queen's College. Hardly anyone entered. A few old dons would sit in the corner for hours and fill the room with their musty and cloacal breath. That's where I went that night in my slippers and baseball cap and read Celan until 3 in the morning. That's where I went on that marvellous, irreplaceable night. So that's not really about childhood. But I could read another passage. But
don't worry if not. It's absolutely fine. I just think I think it kind of. One of the reasons that the dad looms so large in the book is because of the memories of childhood and struggling to...
Yes.
There's another brilliant passage in which the narrator is sitting at a restaurant and his dad tells him to hurry up and eat his food, please, we've got to leave. Mm-hmm. And as a child that would have been an order to be followed, but as an adult it's something very difficult. So I think what you do really wonderfully is capture both senses of the relationship between the two and how it changes, and not writing down to childhood at all. But is that something you find difficult to do? There's another passage you describe where there's another boy in the book and he hates being called names and all things. He's like, I'm not that, I'm William.
Yes. That's kind of, it's partly based on my own younger son, I think. Like if you said something to him like, oh, you're brilliant, he's like, I'm not brilliant, I am Arno. It's just like he just wants to assert his identity. Like any kind of way that you try and label him, even if it's to say that he's fantastic or brilliant, he would just say, I'm not that, I'm Arno. And it just really touched me that in a way he wanted just to assert his own identity. He didn't want to submit to the way that adults describe him, even if they were, completely positive. But I could kind of empathise with that in some ways. Like as a child, your behaviour and your actions are kind of being translated into adult terms. Like you say something you think is profoundly important. It's like, oh, that's so cute. It's like, no, it's not cute. Yeah. This is, I've been thinking about this all morning. And this slightly patronising. They're amused by everything that you do somehow, even when it's something of great import to you, but when it's refracted through the adult mind, it's something turned into something else. And I remember quite vividly experiencing that as a child, and being quite resentful of it. And so, I think when I've had my own children, I've kind of seen that again with them. So I think, a lot of the stuff about childhood couldn't have been written without them and their ways of relating to the world and their ways of relating to language as well, like the way that they use language and the freshness of it and the freshness of their responses to the world, and the way in which it's doesn't have kind of social censorship or social considerations of social etiquette, that they're just able to speak in this way that is incredibly candid and authentic.
Yeah. It's one of the things a lot of books get wrong. They seem to write children as like tiny adults, like the medieval conception of the child just being a lot smaller but a bit crap.
Exactly. Just like deficient in adulthood.
Yeah.
But no, I think at some point the book quotes Rambo saying that genius is the voluntary reclamation of childhood. It's the idea that if you could somehow rediscover the same creative powers and that same aliveness that a child has, then that's what genius is. But for most people it gets erased, or it gets suppressed, or they're kind of educated out of it in some way.
That's a wonderful segue on to my next question.
Okay.
Rambo, and I was thinking about all of the other writers we've mentioned so far, from Beckett to Salon and everyone else. All My Precious Madness is almost, it feels like when you're reading it, a work of literary criticism itself, as well as being a monologue. It's pointless to try and list everyone you mentioned, but I counted a ton. Theodore Adorno, Karl Marx, Roland Barthes, Nietzsche, Claude Cahun, Samuel Beckett. The book is in conversation with so many other works. It's kind of product, as we were talking about, of Henry's autodidactic education. One of my absolutely favourite moments, which has sparked some quite odd Google searches today, is Henry's friend Carvel makes up a story about Seamus Heaney eating 9 slices of spicy sausage pizza and washing them down with a pint of Coca-Cola. I was Googling this afternoon. Seamus Heaney loves junk food. Seamus Heaney pizza. Nothing is coming up at all. No. So where does this world of intellectual references come from? Are they your own interests, or did you dream up a specific intellectual wardrobe for Henry?
It's quite a specific intellectual wardrobe because it's mostly European thinkers, and he's in love with Europe, the idea of being a European writer or a European intellectual. So I think there's very few references to English writers. There's no Evelyn Waugh or D.H. Lawrence.
He calls England the shithole on the periphery of Europe.
On the periphery, Carvel is his friend from Oxford who is a compulsive liar, and I must admit, it's based on someone that I knew at Oxford. But almost everything he says, when they're not talking about philosophy or something, is just like obviously made up. And sometimes there's this secret agreement between the narrator and Carvel not to mention these obvious lies. Like the first one that he says is, Carvel tells him that his uncle, Carvel, was sewn up the wrong way after an operation so that shit came out of his mouth. There's this story that clearly Carvel has invented this story about Seamus Heaney. He followed him into a pizza place, and Heaney was just eating loads and loads of pepperoni pizza, drinking Coca-Cola, and then the narrator asks Carvel, what else was he? Was he reading a book? Yes, he was reading a biography of Mussolini. It's just such a ridiculous image, that Seamus Heaney will be sat eating pizza reading a biography of Mussolini, but it's also kind of a pointless lie. But they're all European references. They're all European intellectuals and writers, and I think it's part of that autodidactic zeal to display your learning as well. So he wants to pepper his speech or his prose with all these references. But having said that, I'm sorely tempted to read out the actual reference to Roland Barthes. It's not really in a very intellectual context.
Do it.
If I can find it. So, do you mind?
Go for it.
So Carvel, the narrator goes to a conference, and he presents a paper at a conference, and he doesn't particularly enjoy this conference. It's devoted to the theme of crime in modern literature. A lot of the papers that are read aren't even about this. They're just these people trying to be European thinkers, trying to be Jacques Derrida or whoever. And there's a particular person at the conference that he finds quite objectionable, whose paper is called Unnameable Women, concerned with the absence of women in various texts by Beckett, and he finds this really irritating. So this guy's called Andrew Mellon. So he makes a quick, unobtrusive exit from the conference. And this is what Henry says. On leaving the conference, I had passed by Mellon's open briefcase. There was a book poking out. The Pleasure of the Text by Roland Barthes. I already had a copy of this book, but I took it nonetheless. There was no reason to steal it. Now and then it's good to do something unaccountable, not just that others are unable to account for, but even oneself. It makes a cut in the fabric of everyday life, which also then allows the air in. At home, I used it as toilet paper. This caused me minor inconvenience, since I could not flush it down the toilet, and had to place the stiff, soiled pages in a small bin, as they do in Greece. I found it amusing to contemplate the gap between Mellon's speculations as to what might have happened to the book, left it at the conference, on the train, etc., and its actual destination, wiping a colleague's arse, which was entirely beyond his power to imagine or comprehend. It amused me also to apply the phrase, a violation of academic protocol, to my act of theft and defilement, because of course it was entirely beyond what might be considered a violation of academic protocol. Violations of academic protocol, are still within the ballpark of academic protocol, so to speak, giving a student a few strong hints as to exam answers and so on. That is a breach of protocol. But again, it is good occasionally to place yourself entirely outside this ballpark and to look at it from the treehouse, drinking wine and laughing, a handful of stars in your pocket. The only page I didn't use was one which contained a kind of luminous quotation, a quotation which I ripped out and stuck on the bathroom wall above the mirror. The pleasure of the text is that moment when my body pursues its own ideas, for my body does not have the same ideas as I do. So, my actions, in fact, displayed more fidelity to the text than Mellon's anal marginalia. The body pursuing its own ideas, exactly. The body escaping its mind, and not, as commonly imagined, the other way around. A pianist would understand, a painter would understand, even a writer maybe. Remember D.H. Lawrence, I write with my hand. So, it's kind of not entirely an act of respectful deference to Roland Barthes, but kind of. He thinks it is in some way.
I think that shows off his kind of playful response to other works of literature,
Yes.
as well as his really quite playful sense of anger and ability to disrupt the world around him, which is something I feel like maybe the questions have skirted around here. It feels quite important to say for people who might not have read the book that Henry is absolutely crazily angry about nearly everything in the whole world. He's kind of fit to burst. You could push him and then it would all start. He's angry about Brexit, about London, about restaurants becoming Nando's, about people revelling in the streets on St. Patrick's Day. He's very angry about his father, and he's very, very angry about all of his friends leaving him as well, it seems.
Yes, at Oxford, yes.
Do you mind doing another reading? One of the vignettes, which I really, really love, is when a man who he names Cahoon is being very, very loud in the cafe in which he likes to work, and it has the most amazing kind of near-absurdist moment of comedy.
Oh, okay, Can you just remind me of the page number? Was it 181?
141. 141.
Okay. So, most of the novel is, in terms of its contemporary setting, is in a cafe in Brewer Street, which is an Italian cafe, and they serve Italian coffee as he likes it. But then this guy comes in who's like a digital marketing manager. He runs a digital company called Jabberwock, and he's always on his phone. He's always having Skype conversations and this, that, and the other, and talking about the world of the digital revolution. And Cahoon, he's called Henry names him Cahoon. He's not called Cahoon because he looks like Claude Cahoon. But Henry just becomes increasingly irritated with him, and decides to do something about it, which you'll read when you read the book. Okay. I made this decision shortly after Cahoon had conducted a Skype conversation with someone in New Zealand, a man called Cy. Investment in UK digital tech is more than twice any other European country, he was saying. I tried to ignore him, but was rudely brought to consciousness by his raised voice, asking Cy about the value proposition. What's the value proposition, Cy? He demanded, and kept reiterating this phrase throughout the conversation. Cy tried to explain what the value proposition was. No point, of course, as the phrase is meaningless. Both of them, Cy and Cahoon, spoke in a language infected and in fact colonised by business jargon and so-called business concepts, which, as I have said, are laughably remote from anything that might with dignity be called a concept. Value proposition, fuck off. Value as some sort of quantifiable add-on unit, fuck off again. I imagined, a kind of daydream following on from the night dream, Cahoon standing in front of manifold, lovely and costless things, stupidly repeating his demand for a value proposition. He's on the Rue Mouffetard at a cafe terrace. There are two old ladies drinking a bottle of wine and laughing. They've been there for hours. But what's the value proposition? Or he's in the Bouche Chaumont. There is a group of old fellas playing bowls under a tree. They were born in the war. They're talking about the 1950s, about austerity and about de Gaulle. Cahoon's watching them, puzzled. What's the value proposition, he intones to himself. He has no idea. He's reading Genet's essay on Giacometti, where Genet says that these thin and selfless gifts are presented to the dead, not the living. But what's the value proposition? Asks Cahoon. He doesn't know. Now he's back in London. Someone's helping a blind man cross the road. Cahoon walks on. There's a busker playing Django Reinhardt. No one stopped to listen, but the busker is smiling. Cahoon stands closer to him. What's the value proposition? He asks himself in a Stephen Hawking voice. The busker can't hear him, of course. Fucking robotic bullshit is not on his radar. The noise from Cahoon's mouth has less meaning than gravel or wind and none of the zest. His voice grows slowly insistent like a Dalek. Unable now to see the value proposition anywhere, his brain short-circuits and implodes. He lies on the ground, his arm jerking up and down, his eyes white and sightless, the voice reduced to a loop of what's the value, what's the value, what's the value. Eventually he's towed away by the council. Sorry. I should really laugh at my own book.
I absolutely love that passage. It made me laugh when I read it and laugh again then. It's just so wonderful because I think you see just how angry he is and also just how playful that anger is. And there's a bit that comes just after which you don't have to read, but it has this kind of ditty that he makes up to sing about Cahoon.
Oh, he does, yes.
Yeah, which feels kind of absurdist and it makes me think of the tra-la-la-la-las in the Wasteland in a kind of way. Just so odd and so bizarre. And we're not going to ruin what happens at the end of the book because I think that would be very unfair. But eventually the anger reaches a point where it kind of comes out.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot of a sense of the book. It's also Henry's thesis that he eventually writes about how there's a difference between the expression of things and that is the thing themselves, which is a very bad way of trying to explain it. What he explains far more eloquently. But I wondered, I don't want you to spoil what happened, but I wonder, how did it feel to change and write the moment which it feels like the whole book has been building to?
How did it feel to change?
To write it, for the change to happen. As you say, like the way that his voice changes as well.
So, yeah, I think it's without giving too much away. It's not quite it's kind of the climax of the book, but it's not the end of the book. And what comes after that climax is a different kind of voice, to some extent. But that different kind of voice has in some ways been facilitated by the climax, because the rage has found a vent, or has been externalized, or has expressed itself. But I feel that passage, like, it's almost as though there's been a momentum through the book, and that's where it's been heading. And so it's gradually, and you're kind of maybe...
In a way it feels like it's odd though, because you're so inside Henry's head and then all of a sudden you're outside of it. You could be forgiven for thinking that everything's imagined and then all of a sudden it isn't.
Yeah, in a very concrete way. Yeah. So writing that, it's funny actually, because I'm just thinking out loud, just thinking of the audiobook with Paul, with that passage, things just like really seamlessly shift, and it's almost like up until then you've kind of maybe been on Henry's side, and then something else emerges. But it's really audible in the book, in the audiobook as well, because Paul does such a brilliant job, and you can hear Paul's own emotions, I would say, in that passage.
It does make you feel like it is a play in a way, because it's so wonderful to listen to. I also think it's one of the moments where you go from thinking Henry's quite sound, I too get annoyed about Brexit and about takeaway coffee cups, to thinking, why am I on the side of a psychopath?
Yes, yeah, and then I think maybe it goes kind of vault fast again at the end.
Yeah.
Just when you thought that.
Yeah.
So it's.
Yeah. Well, so that we don't reveal the plot, we should probably stop talking and ask if anyone had any questions they'd want to ask you.
Yeah.
Well, you're a man of a certain age. I wonder,
yes.
Have you been building up to writing your first novel all this time, or has there been something else that you've been creatively involved in?
I think I have been building up to it for quite a long time. So I was involved in academia for quite a bit. And then I did work in a telesales office for a bit. I think I think from a very early age I've always wanted to think and write and seen that as my end point, or where I wanted to be. And I thought academia was the place where that would take place. Like, academia was the place where I could think and write, and it kind of wasn't, or it wasn't the place where I could think and write in the way that I wanted, for various reasons. And academic writing wasn't sufficiently creative and imaginative, and so then, relatively recently, I started writing this. I mean, it was a few years ago, but it was relatively recently, and I was kind of right back in that place. Partly right back in that place that I used to be in as a child, because I used to write lots and lots as a child. And one time I spent loads of time on this story for English, and really, really proud of it. And then I handed it in, and all the teacher wrote at the bottom was, "Is this your own work?" I was like, I spent so much time on this essay, and that's all she can say. And then I don't know. I think I just, I thought, I want to be an academic. I want to look at literature and talk about literature and discuss literature, which I mean I do, and I like doing that. But I think for whatever reasons, I kind of rediscovered this other kind of creativity and it's to do with a love of language and a desire to kind of really relish language and the rhythms of language and the expressive potential of language, and I don't think, for me it's not something you can do with academia.
Why not?
Because the academic writers that I really admired were people like Walter Benjamin, who were never really full academics anyway, and they had a beautiful way of writing, very aphoristic and full of imagery, full of parables, and but if you tried to write like that in academia, I don't think unless you were already well established, it wouldn't really be accepted. I think there's a kind of form that you have to follow to some extent. I don't know, that's my experience of it, but it was too constraining. Yeah. But there's, just to go back to your question as well, there's quite a lot of autobiographical elements in here, and I feel that so many of the things that I wrote about briefly or thought about briefly have ended up here. It's like I almost think of it as this being some other destination that they've been like travelling through the years. Right, they've ended up in this book. But now I do feel that like that writerly creativity has been unlocked, and so I've like already written the next novel, and I've got ideas for the next novel and the next novel. So it really feels like it's
a long build up to a cathartic moment.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which you've then, and now you're reborn effectively as a writer.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Yeah. So which leaves me with a lot of optimism, because it's nice to be just beginning something at my age,
Yeah.
Bradford, City of Culture.
Yes. Oh, is it really?
I thought you wouldn't know that.
No, I don't.
So this is your time. Have you thought about? Well, now I've told you. You can look into the possibility of your childhood in Bradford and maybe taking a book on the road to Bradford.
Well, I think they might be trying to organise a reading at Waterstones in Bradford, which would be quite probably unnerving and uncanny. No, I do go back to Bradford and West Yorkshire, and the countryside is beautiful, and it's not somewhere that I want to live. I mean, I think Henry is more angry about his background and wants to detach himself from his background in a way, as part of this idea of sort of fashioning something else, like fashioning himself into a new kind of person. But then at the very end of the novel, there is again, without trying to give anything away, there's a going back. There's a going back which is hopefully quite poignant. But yeah, you'll have to read it.
You mentioned as well that you had these experiences and they sort of found themselves in the book.
Yes.
Is that something that you were not keeping track of, but is it when you went to sit down and write the book that you thought, oh, well, I'll use that from when this happened? Or was it all of those experiences that led you to write the book in the first place?
So, no, I think what happened is I started I started writing, and then I just found that certain subjects emerged and certain incidents emerged. And I think that is sometimes what happens when you write, that you don't, in advance, you don't necessarily know what you're going to end up writing about. And just by way of illustration, I once did this poetry course and we had to write a ballad. And so we were just given certain formal rules, which are the rules of writing a ballad. And this ballad that I wrote really was kind of about illness and death and timorousness and not entering into the world. I mean, it was clearly very autobiographical. I mean, ostensibly it was about Franz Kafka. But, but it was clearly really autobiographical. But I just sat down with the intent of, I need to write this ballad for homework. So, like, if I had just, I wouldn't have been able to arrive at those themes and that content just sort of sitting down with nothing. It was the occasion of having to write a ballad. Anyway, I'm not sure that's, I think I've kind of digressed a bit. But yeah, I wasn't quite sure when I started writing, and then suddenly the themes emerged and the experiences emerged, and they all kind of magnetically came together. And all ended up in the same place, really, yeah.
What was the editing process like? Were there moments where you found that the experiences fit in a better order, like at the beginning or at the end, or did it kind of flow chronologically when you wrote it?
No, it didn't flow chronologically. No, it kept looping back into the past. So it was Henry in the cafe being irritated by Cahoon, and then suddenly something sparks a memory, or he goes back to this, or he goes back to that, and he goes back into his childhood frequently, his time at Oxford, and then he goes back to Cahoon. So it's like he couldn't approach any of these one things all at once. His time at Oxford or his childhood, he has to keep going back bit by bit and digressing and looping back, and this sort of circuitous route. There's no sort of direct approach. Sorry, I can't remember. What was
the
it?
editing process.
The editing
like
process.
piecing them together.
No, it was really laborious, actually. It was really laborious because I thought, actually, no, that needs to go a bit further on. Oh, actually, no, that needs to go near the beginning. And I kind of experimented with all of these different structures before it kind of locked together. And what's now the epilogue, so-called epilogue, was completely integrated into the rest of the narrative. It wasn't an epilogue, and I think it works much better as an epilogue. So, yeah, I'm just not someone who's like really good at organising things in advance or planning them out in advance. It's just like a kind of experiment and mix them up, and then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, that's the way it's meant to be. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, if there are no more questions,
Any more questions?
we're probably done. Thank you so much. It was so wonderful to hear you.
Thank
voice,
you.
especially. Thank you.
Thanks all for coming.
Wonderful.